Picture a painting made in the year 1848. A French artist named Frédéric Soriot imagined a world that did not yet exist. In his image, people of every age and class march together in one long procession. They come from France, Germany, Italy, Poland, and beyond. Each group carries its own flag and wears its own national dress, all moving toward a single statue of liberty. Here is what makes that painting strange. When Soriot painted it, most of those nations were not real. Germany did not exist as one country. Neither did Italy. They were dreams carried on flags, hopes painted on a canvas. This was a vision of the future, not a picture of the present. This chapter tells the story of how that dream became real. Over the 19th century, a powerful idea swept across Europe. The idea was nationalism, the belief that people who share a history, a language, and a sense of belonging should govern themselves as a nation. By the end of this story, the old empires of kings would be replaced by nation-states. Let us begin where it all started, with a revolution in France. The first clear spark of nationalism came with the French Revolution in 1789. Before that year, France was ruled by an absolute monarch, a king whose power had no limits and who answered to no one. The country belonged to him, not to its people. The revolution flipped that idea completely. Power was transferred from the king to the citizens. From now on, the revolutionaries declared, it was the people who formed the nation and decided its future. This was a radical thought. A country was no longer a king's private property. It belonged to everyone who lived in it. To build this new sense of belonging, the revolutionaries created powerful symbols. They introduced ideas like la patrie, meaning the fatherland, and le citoyen, meaning the citizen. A new flag, the tricolor, replaced the old royal banner. They wrote new songs, swore new oaths, and honored those who died for the nation. They went much further than symbols. France set up one central system of laws for all its citizens. Internal customs taxes were abolished. A single system of weights and measures was adopted across the whole country. Even language was standardized, as French spoken in Paris became the common language of the nation. Then the French did something that shook the continent. They declared it their mission to free the rest of Europe from kings and tyranny. As French armies marched into Holland, Belgium, Switzerland, and Italy in the 1790s, they carried this new idea of the nation with them. Nationalism had started to travel. The man who spread it furthest was Napoleon. Through his famous civil code of 1804, he swept away privileges based on birth. He established equality before the law and protected the right to property. In the lands he conquered, he abolished the feudal system and freed peasants from serfdom, a condition close to slavery where peasants were bound to the land of a lord. Yet the people did not always welcome him. At first, many cheered the French as liberators. Soon that joy turned to anger. Heavy taxes, censorship, and forced recruitment into French armies made it clear that this was conquest, not freedom. The idea of the nation had been planted, but people now wanted to plant it themselves. Here is something hard to imagine today. If you looked at a map of Europe in the middle of the 18th century, you would not find Germany, Italy, or Switzerland as countries. They simply did not exist. In their place sat a confusing patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, and small territories, each with its own ruler. The biggest of these patchwork states was the Habsburg Empire, which ruled Austria and Hungary. It was not a nation, in any modern sense. It was a collection of wildly different regions, stitched together under one emperor. Its people spoke German, Hungarian, Italian, Polish, and many other languages. They belonged to different ethnic groups and shared almost nothing in common. So what held this empire together? One thing only: loyalty to the emperor. There was no shared identity, no common culture, no sense of a single people. The people here did not think of themselves as a nation. They were simply the subjects of a ruler. To understand how nations were born, we need to look at who lived in this Europe. At the top stood the landed aristocracy, the wealthy families who owned vast estates in the countryside. This was the dominant class, united across borders by a common way of life. They spoke French in high society and married into each other's families. But this powerful aristocracy was tiny in number. The vast majority of people were peasants who worked the land. In Western Europe, much of that land was farmed by tenants and small owners. In Eastern and Central Europe, huge estates were worked by serfs bound to their lords. Then a new group began to rise. As industries grew, towns expanded and new classes appeared. There were working-class people in the factories, and a middle class of businessmen, professionals, and industrialists. This educated middle class is the key to our story. It was among these people that the idea of the nation would find its most passionate believers. The middle class did not just want a nation. They wanted a particular kind of nation, and their vision had a name: liberalism. The word comes from the Latin root liber, meaning free. For the new middle classes, freedom was the whole point. What did liberalism actually demand? In politics, it meant the end of rule by absolute kings. It called for government by consent, a written constitution, and a parliament to represent the people. Liberals wanted equality before the law, so that everyone was judged by the same rules, not by their birth. But here is an uncomfortable truth. Liberal freedom did not mean freedom for all. The right to vote was given only to men who owned property. Men without property and all women were shut out completely. When liberals said equal rights, they really meant equal rights for a privileged few. Women and working men would spend the next century fighting to be included. Liberalism had an economic side too, and it mattered enormously. Liberals wanted free markets and an end to government restrictions on trade. To see why, look at the German-speaking lands in the early 19th century. These lands were divided into a confederation of 39 states. Each one had its own currency, its own weights, and its own measures. Imagine a merchant in 1833 traveling to sell his goods. Crossing from one city to another, he had to stop at 11 customs barriers and pay a tax at every single one. It got worse. A measure of cloth called the L stood for a different length in every region. The very same word bought you different amounts of cloth in different cities. For businessmen trying to trade, this was a nightmare of wasted time and money. So in 1834, a customs union called the Zollverein was formed, led by Prussia. It abolished the tariff barriers between states. It cut the number of currencies from over 30 down to just 2. Add a growing railway network, and goods began to flow freely across German lands. Economic unity was quietly pulling the nation together, one trade route at a time. After Napoleon was finally defeated in 1815, the kings of Europe wanted their old world back. The mood that gripped them was conservatism, a belief that traditional institutions like the monarchy, the church, and social hierarchy should be preserved rather than torn down. But these conservatives were not foolish. They had watched Napoleon, and they had learned something. They did not want to return to the past exactly as it was. They realized that modern tools, like an efficient bureaucracy, a strong army, and a dynamic economy, could actually make old monarchies stronger than before. In 1815, the powers that had defeated Napoleon met to redraw the map of Europe. Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria gathered in the Austrian capital for what became known as the Congress of Vienna. The meeting was hosted by the Austrian Chancellor, Duke Metternich. Their goal was simple: to undo the revolution. They restored the old royal family to the throne of France. They set up a ring of states around France to block any future expansion. The monarchies that Napoleon had overthrown were put back in place. A new conservative order settled over the continent. These new regimes did not tolerate dissent. They feared the ideas of liberty unleashed by the French Revolution. So they imposed strict censorship laws, controlling what could be printed in newspapers, books, plays, and songs. If you criticized the king, you could be silenced. But you cannot uninvent an idea. The memory of the French Revolution still burned in the minds of liberals across Europe. Driven underground, these liberals did not disappear. They simply went quiet, waiting and organizing in the shadows for the moment to strike. In the fearful years after 1815, being a revolutionary was dangerous. To fight for liberty and the nation, you had to do it in secret. So secret societies sprang up across Europe, training young men to overthrow the monarchies and dreaming of nations yet to be born. To be a revolutionary in this age meant two things. It meant opposing the kings, restored by the Congress of Vienna, and it meant fighting to create nation-states where people could govern themselves. For these rebels, freedom and the nation were the same cause. One man towered above the rest, the Italian revolutionary Giuseppe Mazzini. Born in Genoa in 1807, he joined a secret society as a young man and was sent into exile at the age of 24 for attempting a revolution. Exile did not stop him. It only made him more determined. Mazzini founded two underground societies of his own. One was called Young Italy, the other Young Europe, drawing in like-minded young men from across the continent. He believed that God had meant nations to be the natural building blocks of mankind. Italy, he argued, could not remain a patchwork of small states. It had to be forged into one unified republic. His ideas terrified the conservatives. Mazzini attacked monarchy itself and dreamed of democratic republics replacing kings. Metternich, the great defender of the old order, called him the most dangerous enemy of our social order. For a man armed only with ideas, that was quite a reputation. Nations were not built only on battlefields and trade routes. Something quieter and deeper was also at work, and that was culture. Art and poetry, stories and music all helped shape the very idea of the nation. To understand this, we turn to a movement called Romanticism. Romanticism was a cultural movement that pushed back against cold reason and science. Romantic artists and poets cared instead about emotions, intuition, and deep feeling. Their goal was to create a sense of shared heritage, a common cultural past that could bind a people into a nation. Take the German philosopher Johann Gottfried Herder. He argued that true German culture was not found in palaces or universities. It lived among the common people, what he called Das Volk. Through folk songs, folk poetry, and folk dances, the genuine spirit of the nation could be discovered and celebrated. This is why collecting folktales became a political act. The brothers Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, famous today for their fairy tales, spent years traveling from village to village, writing down stories passed down through generations. To them, these tales were the pure voice of the German people, a weapon against French domination. But why did folk culture matter so much? Here is the clever part. Most people in this era could not read. Folk songs and spoken stories could carry the message of the nation to millions of ordinary people who would never open a book. Culture reached where pamphlets could not. Nowhere was this clearer than in Poland. Poland had been carved up and swallowed by Russia, Prussia, and Austria, erased from the map as an independent country. Yet the nation refused to die. When Russia banned the Polish language from schools, priests began using Polish in church as an act of resistance. Many were jailed or sent to Siberia for it. Language itself had become a battlefield, and speaking Polish became an act of defiance. So far, our story has been about ideas and culture. But revolutions are also driven by something far more basic, and that is hunger. The 1830s and 1840s were years of terrible hardship across Europe, and that suffering would light a fire. The population was exploding. There were far more people seeking work than there were jobs to be had. Peasants poured from the countryside into the cities, crowding into filthy slums. Small craftsmen in towns could not compete with cheap machine-made goods flooding in from industrial England. A single bad harvest could push whole regions into starvation. The breaking point came in 1848. In Paris, food shortages and mass unemployment drove people into the streets. They built barricades across the city. The king, Louis Philippe, was forced to flee. A republic was proclaimed, voting rights were granted to all adult men, and the new government promised every citizen the right to work. Behind these dramatic events lay real human misery. Look at the weavers of Silesia, who had revolted a few years earlier in 1845. Contractors gave them materials and orders, but slashed their pay to almost nothing. One day, a crowd of desperate weavers marched to their contractor's grand mansion, demanding higher wages. They were met with scorn. When they broke in, the army was called, and 11 weavers were shot dead. This was the human cost behind the politics. Alongside the revolt of the hungry, a second revolution was rising, one led by the educated middle class. In places without nations, like Germany and Italy, these liberals seized the moment. They combined their demand for constitutions with a demand for national unification. In Germany, this dream took physical shape. In May 1848, 831 elected representatives marched into a church in the city of Frankfurt. There they formed an all-German National Assembly, known as the Frankfurt Parliament. They drafted a constitution for a united German nation, to be headed by a monarchy under an elected parliament. It ended in failure. When they offered the crown to the King of Prussia, he rejected it with contempt. The aristocracy and the military turned against the assembly. Worse still, the middle-class leaders had resisted the demands of workers and women, and so lost the support of the people. In the end, troops marched in and the parliament was forced to disband. And what of women? Women had thrown themselves into these struggles. They founded newspapers, led political associations, and joined demonstrations. Yet when the Frankfurt Parliament met, women were allowed in only as silent observers in the gallery. They could watch the making of the nation, but they were not allowed to vote for it. Their fight was only beginning. In the space of 60 years, Europe began to transform. A revolution in France turned the nation from a king's property into the people's possession. The idea then spread through marching armies, through trade unions like the Zollverein, and through folk tales and forbidden languages. By 1848, that idea had become a force that could topple thrones, even though the liberals' great revolutions ultimately failed. Remember this above all. A nation is not something that simply exists. It is built, struggled for, and imagined into being. In Part 2, we will see those dreams finally turn into real countries, as Germany and Italy are forged into nations.